Well, South Africa is today commemorating 27 years since the first democratic elections. In the early 1990s, the country's democratic transition was threatened by acts of violence as delicate negotiations were taking place. Among them, a right-wing conspiracy to ruin the 1994 election by staging a coup in the northwest of the country, aided by mutinous elements in the SA Defence Force. My next guest will take us behind the scenes ahead of those momentous 1994 polls. Joining us is the then head of the official election monitoring division, Peter Harris, and also part of the conversation, former Independent Electoral Commission head, Judge Johan Kriegler. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. Justice Kriegler, let me begin with you. It, of course, was a difficult task to try and plan an election to accommodate for the majority of South Africans that had never had the opportunity to vote before under a climate of violence. Looking back now, and you know, you've previously described it, like many others, as a miracle, that was a moment of a miracle in this country. Your reflections today, now that you've had the opportunity to truly look at everything that could have gone wrong.
Kathy, you're quite wrong. It wasn't a difficult job. It was an impossible job. It's told us it can't be done. Don't think you can run an election in 3.5, 4 months. You need 3.5, 4 years. It worked. It was a miracle, but like all miracles, it was a miracle because human beings made it happen. And those big human beings were certainly the Electoral Commission, but the political leaders and the people of South Africa. Everybody wanted the exercise to succeed, and that's why it succeeded.
Peter, there was an overwhelming number of people who wanted to make it work, but there were also those who were intent on causing as much disruption as possible. Speak to me about your experience in the days leading up to the actual day of voting and how you were responding to the threats of violence and even the violent acts that were taking place at the time.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, well, I echo the sentiments of the judge in relation to the impossibility of the task that was given to the IEC. It was constituted, I think, in early December, and an election had to be run and be held on special votes were on the 26th of April, and the general voting was on the 27th. But there had been a number of violent incidents and threats of violence incidents, which I think all South Africans will remember. You know, not far, a couple of blocks from the IEC headquarters in downtown Johannesburg, there was a massive bomb that took place in Bree Street just a couple of days before the election. And then, in fact, on the actual day of the election, the 27th of April, in the early morning, there was a massive bomb at what was then known as Jan Smuts Airport, which destroyed a lot of property and injured a lot of people. I think there were 18 people that were injured. Thankfully, no one died in that bomb blast, unlike in the Bree Street bomb blast, in which a number of people died, women and children and adults. So it was a very, very difficult time, and the Commission, under Judge Kriegler and the political parties, had to use their best endeavors to address those issues of violence. I mean, I think the other thing to remember is that at that point, there were large parts of the country that were virtually no-go areas for the IEC, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. And things were extraordinarily difficult, as at that stage, the IFP had not come into the election. They only came in 6 days before, which had a number of dramatic consequences. But there was a lot of violence in certain areas, which made the task of administering an election, free and fair election, extraordinarily difficult.
Of course, the issue of having a party come into the election, like you're saying, Peter, just 6 days before, comes with it and a whole logistical and administrative process that needs to be set off, because you now have to have a ballot paper that accommodates for all the parties that people can vote for.
Yeah, a week before the election was a very short time, but we had been able to plan to get stickers to put the IFP on the ballot paper. The point was that we had determined from the beginning the elections were going to take place on the scheduled day, come hell or high water, come sabotage, come boycott, we were going to proceed. And we managed to do so because I think we persuaded everybody who was against the exercise that this wagon was going to run on. It was on its way and they couldn't stop it.
Determined as you may have been, Justice Krichler, Peter talks about the bombing that took place on the day of the election. Did that make the IEC perhaps want to change its mind or relook how things were going to run?
Kathy, it was very simple. We didn't have a mind to change. We decided on the first week of January the elections were going to take place on the days scheduled. Special voting 26, ordinary voting 27 and following days. That was going to take place. We didn't have to think again. We didn't have anguish as to whether the bombs would stop us. We were going to hold an election as planned and scheduled.
Peter, let's talk about the operations on the ground, because on the actual day itself, you had long queues, you had some logistical issues that created incredible backlogs. How were you dealing with those, and what really contributed to some of the delays that were faced on that day?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and it goes to some of the extraordinary facets of that election. Firstly, the fact that the IFP came into the election means that all the contingency ballots were used up, that the IEC had set aside. I think the second point that needs to be made is that there was no voters' roll in this election. Now, with a voters' roll, you know that 3,000 voters are going to pitch up at the school or a library or a town hall and vote. But in that election, our first democratic election, you could vote anywhere with multiple ID documents. And there was no voters' roll because there wasn't sufficient time to compile one, which made it extraordinarily difficult for the IEC, because the IEC did not know how many people would pitch up at a particular voting station to vote. So it could have been 3,000 or it could have been 70,000, which was in fact the case in many places. So that was one of the reasons why certain voting stations ran out of ballot papers and there were logistical difficulties, because one had to run an election for 22 million people. Remember, previous elections were for 3 million people, white people, and this was for approximately 22. And we really didn't know, although there were estimates, how many people would pitch up at a particular voting station. So it was a logistical nightmare, frankly, to move ballots between voting stations to accommodate unexpected demand at particular voting stations.
And the actual voting of it all, Peter, seemed to just be, you know, the beginning of what would be long days in terms of vote counting. Let's talk about some of the challenges that you experienced there. In fact, to the point where even the credibility of the vote itself was being brought into question.
Yes, I think, you know, there were logistical difficulties. There's just no question. I think we expected some of them. The movement of ballots between stations and from warehouses to stations was a huge exercise. The South African Defence Force came to help in great measure, particularly the Air Force, with choppers moving ballots between provinces and between sort of rural areas and urban areas. But I think, as the judge has said, that election date was written in stone, and that election was going to take place with all its difficulties. And it took longer than expected. There were issues in particular areas that ran out of ballots, and also voting stations opened late in some areas. But it took place. It took place over a longer period than was expected. But those logistical difficulties were overcome. And yes, there may have been some questioning about the veracity of some of the voting in certain areas, but those were overcome by the IEC, and they were addressed to the extent that we ended up with a result that was an accurate reflection of the will of the people of South Africa. And South Africans turned out to vote. They braved the weather, the long queues. They waited for many hours. This was a democratic election that was going to be held, and South Africans came out and made sure it happened.
After the break, I want us to get into the vote counting process and some of the issues that were picked up there, and in fact, hacking that took place where the vote counting machine is concerned. All of that with Justice Johan Kriegler and Peter Harris after this quick break. Continue the conversation about the conspiracy to try and stop the 1994 vote from going ahead. As you heard earlier in this conversation, Judge Kriegler telling us he was the IEC commissioner, he was the head of the IEC at the time, telling us about how they were intent on that election going ahead, regardless of the circumstances and the opposition that they faced. Peter Harris was the head of the official election monitoring division, also dealing with some of the issues that were unraveling on the ground. So once voting is done, Justice Kriegler, talk to me about the time that you then discover that there may be an issue with the vote counting, and in particular, a problem that seems to be embedded in the vote counting system that was being used at the time.
Kathy, I think everybody in the IEC on the admin side, on the monitoring side, was dedicated to make the balloting work. When we had balloting crises and problems and logistical problems, we concentrated on that. Little did we realize that the counting and the consolidation of the data would be an even bigger problem than merely the balloting issue. First of all, the ballot papers came in after several days of voting. The voting staff were exhausted. The voting ballot collecting people at the polling stations. They didn't fill in the forms properly when they came and handed in their ballot boxes to the various collection places where the votes were to be counted. They didn't have ballot boxes in some places of sufficient quantity to accommodate all of the ballot papers. So you actually had marked ballots coming in other containers than ballot boxes. All sorts of suggestions such as that the process was irregular. The people in the counting stations, some of them went on strike and wanted additional pay. They wanted overtime pay. So we had staff relation problems with them. Political parties said that because the balloting process had not signed off properly at each polling station, the ballot boxes had to be rejected. That caused a major logistical and legal hold-up. In fact, at one point at Nasrec, I personally saw a mountain of ballot boxes several days, nearly a week after the election, that had not yet been opened because there was an impasse between the political parties whether they could open them without the requisite forms signing them off. All of this delayed the issue, raised the tension, and then, of course, in the middle of that, we found out that the Central Data Collection Center had been penetrated and somebody was dripping in votes for the right wing of the ballot paper.
Peter, when that discovery was made, do you remember what your initial reaction was, especially as somebody who, I suppose at the coalface of things, would have to deal very directly with some of these issues?
Yeah, look, it was one of horror, to be frank. You know, we got a call. One of the UN specialists had picked up that there was a problem in the multiplication of certain votes, as just been stated, for certain parties. And that was a disaster because it was an electronic counting system. We did have a manual counting system that moved behind the electronic system by about 2 days. It was about 2 days behind because it's much slower. You're doing it manually, where you were counting the votes on each tally sheet. But I think that the response of the commission and certainly of the administrators or people actually in charge of running the election was one of shock and horror. And I think the judge will recall that the commission then took the decision to close down the electronic counting system and then revert to the manual counting system, which was running 1 or 2 days behind, which is one of the reasons why for a particular period of time, the communication of results at Gallagher Estate, where there was a very sophisticated communication center, was halted to allow for the manual vote to catch up. I think the judge will have his own reflections of those terrifying times.
Kathy, I would like to add to that once we realized what had happened, we did 3 things. As Peter said, we switched over to the manual, which his people in monitoring had been conducting. Number 2, we called in representatives of all of the major accounting firms in the country to come and sit in and audit every single bit of work that was being done. And thirdly, we played open cards with the public. We did not try to withhold from the public what had happened and what its implications were and what we were doing. And I think between those 3 steps that we took on the day that the interference was discovered, saved the bacon.
So, you know, given the fact that you had so much insight into everything that could have gone wrong, and yet it didn't. You described it as a mission that was impossible, that somehow with the dedication of the people of this country and hardworking individuals like yourself, the election went off and it was able to be declared a successful election. 27 years on, are there particular reflections that you have looking back at that moment, and I suppose also looking at where we are in South Africa today? Peter?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, I think there are a couple of aspects to that question. The first is that the subsequent elections, I think, have been run extremely well by the IEC. They had the time to put in place systems and mechanisms to conduct free and fair elections, and I think they should be congratulated for ensuring that we have had free and fair elections subsequent to 1994, which have reflected the will of the people, as did that election. You know, clearly, you know, the broader political question, or the political question or the economic question is, you know, do people enjoy the fruits of that democracy to the extent which they might have expected? And I think that there are a number of groupings that would comment on that, and in relation to expectations that have been met and haven't been met. But what I can say to you is that this country is in a far, far better place than it was prior to April 1994.
Justice Kruger?
Kathy, yes. I entirely agree with Peter. The current IEC was built on the sound foundation of the IEC of 1994. We learnt the lessons of that election. We learnt the lessons of the electorate and its idiosyncrasies, and the IEC that we have today was built with that model in mind. It has been adapted. It's done an excellent job. I've worked many elections elsewhere in the world, and I can say that for consistency of excellence of delivery of election results, the South African IEC stands proud with the best anywhere that I have been. Compare it with the Americans that have had over 200 years of experience, and the mess that they have, and the complaints that they have, and the court cases that they have. We are infinitely better off, electorally speaking, than anywhere else that I have worked. As far as where we are as a country, I think we all had dreams, we all had expectations. I believe that if anybody today says he isn't a little bit disappointed, he's not being truthful. But with Peter, I couldn't agree more. We are in an infinitely better place than we were. In fact, we're in a different place. We're in a democracy. We were not in a democracy. We were headed nowhere up to 1994. We're on our way now. It's uphill. There are problems. What was said earlier this evening about Orange Farm and the disappointment of the people there reflects fairly generally the sentiments of a large number of South Africans. But we are in a better place. We will get there. It will take time, though.
Peter, are you particularly nostalgic or sentimental about this day at all?
Yes, I think I am. I think all South Africans are actually, regardless of whether their expectations have been met. And, as has been said, I think that there are great challenges in terms of poverty and inequality that still need to be addressed within the country. But yes, I mean, those were terrifying times because I think that everyone that worked in that commission and the commissioners headed by the judge were very keenly aware that if that election did not work, that there was a real prospect of the country burning. And that it would have been very, very hard to control or to avert a disaster. It was an election that, while it had difficulties and great challenges, I think all of the political parties, or most of them that participated, knew that it had to work. And they accepted those results. They were an accurate reflection of the will of the people. But yes, at times I kind of wake up and I have to pinch myself that we got through that.
Yeah. Justice Krichler, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Kathy, I do on occasion actually still get cold shivers. Particularly when I hear a phone ring with the ringing tone that my office had in the IEC. Involuntarily, I get a shudder. We did actually face the precipice. I am sure that if the election failed, we would, heaven knows what we were facing. There were a large number of people. The majority wanted the elections to succeed, but there was a significant body of objectors, active, passive, boycotters, and actual saboteurs. Where we would have been, the Lord only knows. I'm grateful to this day when I think back that it worked. It worked for a number of reasons, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you both so much for coming onto the show tonight and just sharing your reflections on where we've come from as a country, and I suppose just the foundation of this day and why it's so important for South Africans to value the fact that we can actually vote and why that matters even to date, especially in an election year. Peter Harris, he was the head of the Official Election Monitoring Division, and the former IEC Commission head, Judge Johan Krichler. Happy Freedom Day to both of you, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Ola Njinga is standing by with your sport. Do stay tuned for that. Ola?